Welcome to Feather Your Nest, every quilter's goal. So if you're trying to stitch feathers that are plump or skinny, curved, long, short, it just doesn't matter. You can put them all together and make one beautiful design element. I'm hoping through this series that you will learn a few different tricks on how to make the feathers that you're hoping to make. So just relax and enjoy. We're going to take it a step at a time like we do with all my training series. We're going to break it down, and I can almost bet you that when we're done with this series, you're going to be the next feather champion. So hold on to your seats. Here we go. So that we're on the same page when we talk about the feathers, let's go over the parts of the feather. Now the first thing that we need to look at is the very bottom, and that's called the quill. That's also a place where you might lead in from another design into that feather. Notice there are no plumes on this part of the feather. Traveling up the feather, you'll see where it's marked up curved edge. That's the angle that we stitch the plumes at, and they're generally about 45 degrees. Traveling up a little further, you'll see where it's marked parallel barbs. We call these plumes, and that's the individual segments that make up the feather. Just as in nature, these plumes, or barbs, have to have a place to call home, and that is called the shaft. We refer to it as the spine. Every plume begins and ends at the spine. It goes out of the spine at an angle and comes back in at an angle. Generally, these meet at a point. And last, but definitely not least, it's the crowning touch, is the feather tip. Before we begin on this basic shape, though, let's take a look at some of these photographs of feathers. Do you see the one thing that they all have in common? It doesn't matter if they're swirly in borders, or using different colors of thread, or being used in a circle, or just a free-for-all all over the quilt. The one thing they all have in common is the basic plume shape. Take a look at each picture. Can you see that shape? Here's another thing they all have in common. Do you see how each one of the plumes on these feathers, no matter what the shape, are all going in and out of the spine at an approximate 45-degree angle? We'll keep that in mind. Now, I understand a lot of you have tried to draw feathers, and your complaint is you can't even draw them, let alone stitch them. Well, some people just don't draw very well, and I'm one of them. But I bet if somebody asked me to draw this picture here, I could probably get it pretty close. How about you? So if you can't draw the whole picture of the house, how about this one, just the bird? Can you do that? I'll make it even easier. How about just half a bird? Only one thing left to draw, the sun. And you don't need to put the face on it, and you don't need to put the sun rays on it. So basically you just need a circle. And if you can't draw a circle, you can use a nickel and trace around the nickel, and you'll have your circle. Well, now you might be asking yourself, how can drawing half a bird and a circle allow me to make a feather? Well, let me show you. The first thing you need to do is draw that circle. Now let's draw that half a bird wing so that it meets the bottom center of that circle. Now you need to draw from the bottom of the circle to the middle of the top of the circle. Now draw another bird wing until you get back home again. Congratulations! You've just drawn your first feather. When you were little, this is the way you were taught to make birds. And you just drew birds over and over because they were so easy. You did an arc, and then you did another arc. And there you had your beautiful bird, and you'd fill the sky up with those. Well, feathers are going to start out with this very same thing, except we're not going to do this half of the bird right now. We're not doing this. We're just going to concentrate on this half. So I have that stitched there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift this out just for a moment, and I'm going to draw a circle. Now I'm going to go on to step 2, which means I'm going to stitch from this part of the circle up to the top half of the circle. So let's do that. And we'll stop there. Now I'm going to stitch from here all the way down to where I started. And there's my first feather plume. Let's get rid of the circle. And you can see we have a very nice feather plume. So the only thing that you have to keep in your mind is to swing up like draw your feather wing around the sun and back home again. Okay, so let's try that by drawing a bunch of circles in a row, and I'll show you how we're going to do that. For this next exercise, let's take this feather a little further, because when we did this, it wasn't really a feather, it's just a plume of the feather. Now we want to do a series of plumes that all meet down at the spine so that we can get one blade of the feather done. So in order to accomplish that, in order to practice it, I've just drawn a series of circles, or in our case, suns, right up from each other. I've left about 1/4 of an inch of space between each one. I drew a straight line to indicate our spine, and I put another sun right at the top of that spine. So, using those tools, we're going to go ahead and do 1/2 of a real feather. So we're going to start on the spine. Meet up at the center bottom, around the sun, to the top of the sun, and back down again. Now we're going to come back up again to the middle of the sun and bottom, around the sun, and a bird wing back home again. Now we're we're going to do another one to the middle of the bottom of the sun, around that sun, and back home again. And again, we're going to come up to the middle bottom of the sun, around the sun, and back home again. Now, to top it off, the cherry on the top, we're going to come up to the side of the sun, go around, and come back home again. So now you've stitched 1/2 of a feather. Now again, let me remove the marks, and there's your feather. Now you notice that this has got a little bit of spacing between each one of these. Now if you don't want the spacing, let's do a different type. Let's come over here. Now you notice for a while we're just going to be doing one side of the feather. We'll move over to the full feather in a little while. So we're going to stitch the spine of the feather, starting at the top and working down. And again, we're going to just start with straight spines. We'll get fancy later on in the series, but for now, let's just make it straight. So now we're going to do a feather. And this time, we're going to, we did a plume. This time let's do another plume, but let's just stitch right over top of the previous plume. I'll do that again real slow. Over the stitches of the previous plume, around the sun, and back home again. And then we'll just put the cherry on the top. So far we have learned to do 2 different types of traditional feathers. We've done the ones without any backtracking at all, the ones that were pretty easy to do once you learn the basic plume. And then we did the ones that were a little harder because they needed to be using backtracking in order to complete them and get them close together. So these ones are a little slower to stitch because of the fact that you're doing the backtracking. Now I'm going to show you my favorite type of feather. It also requires some backtracking, but not nearly as much as this one. The reason why I really like this feather is there's so much you can do with it. You can make them skinny, you can make them fat, you can reach them out, you can get just really grandiose with these feathers. And these are called the bump back feathers. So let's first stitch our spine, and I'm going to stitch a curvy one this time because I just can't do these feathers without getting fancy. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is trim away this thread. As soon as I find my scissors. There. So let's trim this thread away. We're going to start out with a regular feather plume, like we always do. Now we're not going to backstitch over the back of this plume, but instead we're going to go up the spine just a little bit and spread that feather out, and we're going to touch the feather before it. And then we're going to backtrack only on the top rounded part of that feather. And then we're going to come back to the spine. Let's do that again. So we're going to go up the spine just a little bit. Come around. Let's backtrack over the hump. And come back down again. Up the spine a little bit. And back down again. And I like to hook up with the start of the spine. Now I'm going to take advantage of a mistake that I made, because right here, when I came up, I didn't stay on the spine. So I'm just going to accentuate that by coming down and making it look like it was supposed to be that way. So that's one way of many that we're going to discuss. How do you get back down to the beginning to start over again? So if I wanted to do the feathers on the other side, I am now in position to do those. And you can see when doing these feathers, they're done in a series of 2 feathers. You go up, you bump the feather before it, come over, and then come back down to do a regular feather. And now we're to the top, so I'm just going to go ahead and put the finished plume on top. And we're going to call this feather done. Now you can see why this is my favorite feather. I have some really fat feathers in here, right next to some skinny feathers. I have some long feathers next to some shorter feathers. And it gives the feather a lot more interest than just straight up and down on one side. So that's why these are my favorite. So between the two, again, you have, when you do this one, you have to back stitch around, back stitch and around, back stitch and around. On this one, we're going to go up and then backtrack just on the tip of the feather and then hook around and finish what would be a regular plume without going up first. So in other words, we're just doing this part of the plume on the second half of the bump back feathers. So let's do that again. We're going to go up, bump the feather before it, then we're going to backtrack around the top. We're going to go from the bottom of the sun to the top of the sun, and then come up from the bottom of the sun and back again. So we don't have nearly as much backtracking to do on this type of a feather. And you can see you can get very dramatic with it. Since most people stitch feathers better from the bottom up, we need to figure out how we get to the bottom again once we've gone up to the top on one side. We've come down here as one way to get from the top to the bottom by stitching over top of the previous spine. Now on camera and in person, you can see the thread build up on that spine. Now let's turn it over, because I've got a light thread in the back side. And because I'm using a matching thread and a finer thread, you don't notice the thread build up nearly as much as you do on the other side. So all the feathers look totally different when it's stitched in the same color thread. So don't despair when you're practicing. When you're doing feathers, you generally are not using a contrasting thread unless you've become very confident in your feather stitching. You're normally using a thread that blends in with your background. So don't let that part worry you. Now let me show you another way to get back down to the bottom. On this one again, we backtracked the spine that was already there. So we're going to do another one. We're going to stitch in the spine. And I'm just going to make this a slight curve. And let's trim this thread away so it doesn't interfere with your view when we get back up there. Now this time I'm just going to do regular feathers.
If you notice while I'm stitching these feather plumes, I'm not going all the way back to the point, but because we have a spine there, it just looks that way because of the angle I'm coming at.
And as I get to the top, I generally start to shorten them up a little bit. And let's do the top of the, I call that the cherry on top plume. Now, we've already come back down the same spine. Here's another way we can do this. Let's go in between these plumes and let's echo these plumes until we get back down here. And now we're ready to start stitching again. Because for some reason, for most people, it's easier to stitch feathers from the bottom up. Okay, now that we're up here, I'm going to stick in between these same feathers again. And echo back down the other side. So now we don't have the heavy buildup of thread in the middle like we do on this one, but yet we were still able to get back down to the bottom to do the other side. Now let me show you another way to do this. And let's put the cherry on the top. Now instead of echoing back this time we're going to put a double spine. And I'm just going to make it about 1/8 of an inch wide. Because if you look at a real feather, it does have a heavy spine in between. It's just not a line. So now we're down at the bottom. We can begin our feathers again. So on this feather, we will have absolutely no thread buildup on the center spine at all. We're just mimicking nature. And in this case, we don't need to echo. We've come back down the spine and everything's good to go. Now let me take one other avenue of how we can do this. And this is usually done on a little larger feather than what we're doing now. But I'm going to go ahead and attempt it in a small manner. So let's go ahead and stitch the spine. Now I'm going to do the bump back feather so I can get a little dramatic here. Because what I'm going to show you next is a little more dramatic way of doing the spine to get back down. Okay, we've joined up to where we started. Now this time, I'm purposely going to make this wider and then taper down to join at the bottom. Now you can see already, this is a fanciful feather. It sure isn't what you'd call traditional. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to go up the other side. Okay, at this point we can stop, or we can get even fancier by doing pebbles or many different types of stitches in the center. We could do loops, we could do a fishbone design, we could do a series of scallops, we could do just straight lines. The list goes on and on of what you can do in here. And now you have a pretty fancy feather and also a pretty fancy way of getting down to the bottom. Now, the last method that I'm going to show you is the one that took me the longest to learn. I just couldn't get my brain wrapped around how to do this. But I finally figured it out and I want to share it with you. Now we're going to do, because it's a little more complicated and you really have to think about it, I'm just going to do a straight stem. And I'm not going to get fancy, I just want to explain to you the process behind the way we do this. Excuse me. Now if you recall when we did our Back to Basics series, I tried to emphasize that you need to learn how to do different stitches from left to right, from right to left, from bottom up, from the top down, diagonally, however you need to do it to quilt a quilt so that you don't have to keep twisting your quilts around. Well, when you do, say, a long line of feathers, say you're doing this in a border, if you got the one side done, now you have to somehow stitch that whole long border all the way down again to get to the other side. Or you could break thread, or you could do it this way. Let's do the one side of our feather again. Okay, now this is where you have to put your thinking caps on. When we did our feather plume, right back down here from the beginning, let me see if I can fold this up so you can see it. Remember how we did the bird wing to the bottom of the sun, we went around the sun, and we came back down again. Okay, so now we need to do that in reverse. So in other words, we need to do this part from here to here first. That's number one. Then we have to do this part as the second step. And the original bird wing we have to do as the third step. So we have first step, second step, third step. So we have first step, around the sun, and now the bird wing with the curve on it. Now we have to, do you see how much room it takes to do this top one? That means we have to come down the stem a little bit to make room for that. Down a little bit. Down a little bit. Down a little bit. Now, I'm getting the shape right, but I'm not getting the angle right. I'm doing the first plume, pretty much the first step of the plume, pretty much like I was half-heartedly doing it. So let me draw just the spine. Do you see how high these feathers are going? Let's try doing it over here. Let's try to make that high. Let's make the sun. And now we need to maintain that 45-degree angle, but yet do a curve. So it looks like a comma. Now we're going to go down the stem a little bit, come back up, we can follow that shape around the sun and make that comma. Go down further, go up, around, make the comma. Go up, around, and make the comma. Now, can you see the difference between this side, where these kind of look like a plant that needs watered because they're kind of drooping, versus this side that's perked up a little bit? That's what you want to do. You want that to match your other side. You want it to have the same angle as this side has. So if I put the feathers that we stitched when we first started next to the ones that I just did, you can see that the angle is still a 45-degree angle, and that would make a nice looking feather. So that's another thing that you can practice, is learning how to make your feather plumes backwards.
There's so much more to learn in feathers, but this gives you your primary steps. Learn to make that plume, that's number one. Keep practicing that over and over until you get that shape down. Then learn the different types of feathers, whether it's the no backstitch or the ones where you backstitch the plume next to the one you just stitched, or whether you do the bunk back feathers. There's so many different ways to do them. Also practice the different methods of getting back down to the beginning, or doing your feathers from the top down. I'll see you next time.